gone to the next step. We know what autonomous database is. It's a PDB. There were two types: autonomous transaction processing and autonomous data warehouse. Well, let's take another look at the real world, because I have somewhere here, just let me get to my appropriate link. So the little autonomous environment I configured for today what I've got here, in terms of compute nodes, I have created one compute node, which I'll maybe log on to later on. And in terms of databases, I've created two autonomous databases. One of them is a data warehouse, an ADW, an autonomous data warehouse. The other is an ATP, an autonomous transaction processing autonomous database. So those are the two types. However, recently, and this is new, you have autonomous JSON database. And our developers are pretty excited about what you can do with autonomous JSON. I have to say, as a database administrator, the implications of using autonomous JSON are a bit, I'm not exactly up to discussing that, but it certainly looks to me to be a very powerful capability. And it was this is pretty new to appear in the autonomous environment. Now, so we've got ATP and ADW. So what's the difference? Well, I'll log on to them and we'll have a look. What you typically find is that the defaults for these two types of ADB are different. For example, data storage. Well, if I log on to my ATP database, I'll go through the details of connecting later on, by the way. Put that wrong. That's ATP. Right. And if I say create a little table, and you'll see the sort of differences that we get between the two. What I'm going to do is create a table, which couldn't be simpler. Oh, I've already got one. Drop table T1. Drop table JW.T1. Right. So I'm creating a table just with defaults for everything. Defaults for everything. And straight away you'll see, if you look at a query here, select table name compression, compress 4 from DBA tables where n equals JW, there's no compression. Whereas if I connect admin at ADW, which is my autonomous data warehouse, and create a table there, I created the schema JW earlier, you'll see how that has been created. Compression is enabled, query high, row level locking. Interesting, isn't it? You can override it.
So obviously there's going to be some sort of list of features that are enabled or configuration parameters for the database ADW that are set differently than the transaction processing database. So what would be really slick is if you were using transaction processing, for example, and then realize you needed DW. Can I push and click to change it?
You can't change the type of database. You can, however, override all these details. When I created the table in ATP, I could have specified compress query high with row level locking. So you can override it manually. But you can override it in the DDL, but somehow or other, Oracle is applying defaults to all the DDL you execute. And I do not know how they're doing it, but that's going on in the background. So this is, of course, hybrid columnar compression. Hybrid columnar compression, and they've gone for that algorithm, which is one of the highest algorithms. Can achieve maybe 50 to 1 compression with that. So, and you could use hybrid columnar compression in ATP as well, but you'd have to specify it. Row level locking, that requires the advanced compression option. That's included. That's included. So that's an example of the most basic default. ATP, by default, your data is stored in proper normal relational tables. ADW, by default, your data is stored in what's really a non-relational structure of hybrid columnar compression, columnar format. All of the automation for tuning. We've got automatic index creation, of course, and that will be available in both environments. For example, if you look at say the auto index config, if I go to say ATP, if we look at the auto indexing config, remember that's the release 20 capability. We see these are the, it's all enabled, it's all there and configured for you. But again, you could override these with DDL commands if you wished. But as a general rule, ATP is going to go for indexes, index access paths, because we're assuming, for any normal ATP transaction processing environment, you probably want execution plans based on index access paths. ADW is going to push its emphasis more towards summary tables, the automation and materialized view management, for instance. Memory is another big one, over which you don't have that much control. But in my ATP environment, if we look at how this is configured, I have been given for this little one, I'm not working on a paid for license here. The memory is being assigned is 3 GB of RAM for PGA, 8 GB of RAM for the SGA target. Whereas if we look at the ADW environment, we find a rather different setup. Interestingly, perhaps not quite as much memory in total, but you see that it is skewed, of course, much more towards PGA. And this makes perfect sense. I'm sure we all know that in a data warehouse environment, you probably want loads of PGA so you can do all your hash joins, all your massive aggregations and so on. Whereas in a transaction processing environment, you want buffer cache. So different defaults in the two environments, many, I won't say most, but many of which can be overridden. But as Dave was asking, or put the question through, you can't change the type after creation, to the best of my knowledge.